Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Dennis MacDonald, and today we're going to be discussing how Dennis reconstructs Q and the methodology that he uses to do just that. So welcome back to the show, Dennis.
Jacob, it's a pleasure. And you need to be complimented for having the courage to put this kind of thing on a podcast. I've probably done 100 podcasts, and no one has attempted to deal with the Q reconstruction, which in my view is so terribly important for understanding not only the Gospels, but the historical Jesus and the early development of the Christian movement. And the reason people have shied away from it is it is very technical. And I can only give the methodologies that one uses, and I can give a couple of examples. But most of this has to be viewed in a book, unfortunately. Now, the book that is most accessible now is Synopses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels, which is available for under $40 with Amazon. And it has large discussions of the Q reconstruction. It has the reconstructed text in Greek and in English and so on. So I would recommend that people look at that. Now, what we're going to talk about today, Jacob, is another book that I'm hoping to have come out at least by the end of the summer, called Homer and the Quests for Q and Jesus. And so what we're going to do is to walk through the arguments of that book. And I want to preface it with this comment. People may know about the Q document, but my reconstruction of the Q document is very different from that of regular Qs that you'd find, let's say, in the critical edition of Q, or in almost anything that you'd read about Q. And the methodologies are so importantly different that they yield a document that is much longer, more articulate, and more important historically than what you're going to find in traditional Q research. Unfortunately, the arguments are very detailed, and there's an entrenchment in biblical scholarship between two camps. That is, those who argue for a Q, but it's not my Q, but they argue for a Q, and those who deny it. And I agree with both camps. And my solution, which is called the Q plus Papias hypothesis, which we could talk about at some point, it falls between the cracks. And I'm so grateful that I have this venue with you to describe what the differences are, and perhaps to tantalize people to take a look at an alternative solution of the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is over a millennium. It's almost 2 millennia years old. And it's simply the way that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are literarily interconnected. So which came first, which came last? Did they have lost sources? What's their orientation to oral tradition? Are they simply recording tradition? Are they creating it? And so on. And it's had so many false starts. And most of the solutions that one will find in the history of scholarship and even today are tragically flawed. Now, I'm not saying that I can, verbatim reconstruct the lost gospel, but I think there should be little doubt that I come closer than others, and I avoid some of the mistakes that others are making. Now, many people have shown appreciation for my arguments that there's imitation of Greek poetry in the Synoptic Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, and even in the Gospel of John with Euripides' Bacchae. But these same people seem to be very skeptical about the Q hypothesis. And I want to put it into a larger context. The quest for Q is similar to what classicists do when they're trying to recover a lost document or the lost earliest version of a document. And we even have this in New Testament textual criticism, which I'm going to give as an analogy. But one can find it as exactly the same methodology in the search for Jewish texts in Greek. What is the earliest version of the book of Tobit, for example? Because we have Armenian fragments, we have Aramaic fragments, we have Greek fragments, we have some Lucan, some Latin texts. But the way the text critic works is this way, Jacob. One starts with manuscripts and witnesses to a document. So there we have physical evidence. But we know that much of this physical evidence does not represent the earliest form of a text. So textual critics then compare the various physical manifestations we have of the text and witnesses to it, and on the basis of certain criteria, make judgments about what is the likely grandparent text that no longer survives. Now, in order to do that, one uses criteria to determine which reading is more primitive than another. Now, the reconstruction of these grandparent texts is already conjectural. Now, scholars have two ways of trying to present that work. One is to simply present those grandparent texts in parallel columns and avoid conjecturing about where they came from. The other choice is to not only, and those are called diplomatic editions, by the way. They're diplomatic because they're not attempting to rescue a conjectured antecedent. But in many cases, in order to find the earliest version of a text, one needs to do conjecture. And that introduces a new level of subjectivity, but it's not arbitrary. You have criteria that are used to determine which of these textual witnesses is most likely to appear in another text. Now, I've done work like that on the Acts of Paul, but especially the Acts of Andrew. And I learned from mostly European philologians who are interested in recovering lost Christian apocrypha. So the apocryphal Acts of Apostles or various hagiographa. And some of these scholars are only interested in diplomatic editions. I'm actually interested in going beyond that to have conjectural, likely original texts. Now, those texts do not appear in any manuscript. They are a project that starts with the physical manuscripts, it goes to the editions, and then there's another layer of conjecture that you need to get to the next level. So what happens in the Gospels? We have thousands of witnesses by text and by witnesses to the New Testament Gospels. So scholars put those into families of manuscripts where they share readings. They then find grandparent family resemblances. They can check on the DNA of the grandparent text. And if from that, then they compare the grandparent texts and they come up with the text of the New Testament. Now, you could say that gospel synopses are diplomatic editions. That is, they are conjectural, but not arbitrary, usually scientifically established versions of the grandparent text of these early manuscripts. So when people squawk about Q, I can say that the very text that you read in translation for your New Testament is already a conjectural product. That doesn't mean it's not correct, but it does mean that it's not reflected in any of the manuscripts. Now, when we take a look at a gospel parallel, we find then we have a scholarly edition of Mark, of Matthew, and of Luke. And it's built on scholarship, and these texts that we have in printed editions of the New Testament are not identical by any means to any manuscript that we actually have. Now, we also know with the synoptic problem that these texts are related to each other, and one is a parent of another. And that's most likely Mark. But we can't explain the synoptic problem solely on the basis of the connection of these texts to each other. So what happens in the history of the synoptic problem, Jacob, is that we have people moving the same pieces around the table. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. But what we need is a better criteria to fill in the gaps, to see how these pieces fit together. And one of the ways of establishing those other pieces is to suggest that there may be a lost source or sources. And this is where redaction criticism and source criticism kicks in. Unfortunately, people have ignored the importance of imitation of Jewish scriptures and classical Greek poetry as a way of understanding those pictures as well. And so one of my ambitions in life, I hope it's my dynasty that's important, except for the importance of my grandchildren, is that they would understand that these gospels are imitating Jewish and especially Greco-Roman literature, the poetry, and that they're using a now lost source. So the question is, what criteria does one use to reconstruct the source? So maybe I'm going to let you ask a question at this point, Jacob. I've been going on for a bit. And then when you're done with the question and my response to it, then let's take a look at the first slide.
So you mentioned a moment ago that no two manuscripts are identical to one another. Could you elaborate on what that means exactly to the audience? Because some of them might not understand that, and how that further complicates things.
Well, let me rephrase the question, which is a good one. That is, the texts of the New Testament that are produced by scholars and with great care and erudition are not identical to any of the texts that one finds in the history of the book. Of course, in antiquity, there was no Xerox machine, there were no computers, and that scribes transcribed a text and did so not just with the care of a great scribe, but they also did so as theologians. And we know that there are intentional errors that appear in the manuscript tradition, but probably more, it has to do with improving the grammar or avoiding certain difficulties. And so the scribes are inventing the text as much as they're transcribing the text. Now, that's overstated, I suppose, but that's one reason we have so much diversity in these texts. And we should respect that. These people are spending their lives and their livelihood on the preservation of these texts and to make them work for their communities or for themselves. And but they depart from the grandparent text. And so that's what we're trying to do. And by the way, the same thing happens in Greek literature otherwise, or Latin literature or Jewish literature. You have this scribal manipulation of the text, and the job of a modern scholar is to determine what are the better readings that we can use for getting as far back to the text as we can. Now, by the way, I should say, there's a big debate now among textual critics about whether this interest that I have in primitivity and originality is the way to go. In many textual critics would say, no, you need to live with the diversity. It's the diversity of the tradition that's more important than its genesis. I, however, am old-fashioned enough to think that the genesis of a tradition is an important thing to examine. And that's especially true, in my view, with the Synoptic Gospels. I want to know where these materials come from, especially the sayings traditions. I want to start with a nod to traditional Q scholars. In the origin of the Q hypothesis, people recognized that, let me actually back up a little bit. In my book, Homer and the Quests for Q and Jesus, I begin by talking about Mark's imitations of Homer and how it establishes his priority to Matthew and Luke. So there in the bottom line of the handout, you see priority of Mark to Matthew and Luke is demonstrated because Matthew and Luke would follow Mark, but never are more primitive than Mark when it comes to these other stories. So that is, in parentheses, Mark is earlier than Matthew and Luke. Then we have, in chapter 2, I talk about Luke's posteriority to Matthew. And I don't want to go too much into the details here because we have so much more to talk about. But the order of the synoptics almost certainly has to be Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. And the reason that's important is that if one finds a deviation from that sequence, a phenomenon I call reversed priority, that may be an indication of a lost gospel. So, for example, if Matthew is written after Mark, but in Matthew we find things that are more primitive than Mark, we have to ask where that comes from. It could come from oral tradition. It could come from multiple sources. It could come from a single source. The same thing's true, even more so, with Luke. Luke is written almost half a century after Mark, it would appear. But in many cases, he has content that's more primitive than Mark and more primitive than Matthew. So this criterion of reverse priority is a possible because we now know what the sequence of the Gospels is. It's Mark, Matthew, Luke. Now you're going to have people who are, you'll read that say, no, Matthew is earlier than the others, or Luke is earlier than, even Luke is earlier than the others. That is impossible in my view. And there are three different kinds of interpretations of the Synoptic Gospels. And by the way, I think for good reason, they're the dominant ones. One argues, and all of them, by the way, and what holds them together and makes them most credible is all of them, including mine, hold to this sequence: Mark, Matthew, Luke. Now, in the red, you can see the highlighting of what these criteria are for inverted priority. First, the independence of a narrative is earlier than its concept. I'm sorry, the independence of a saying is more primitive than its narrative contextualization, When one version of a saying stands on its own, it generally is earlier than one assimilated to a narrative context. Difficulty, embarrassment, or ambiguity is more primitive than improvement, because when one version contains a problem, it generally is earlier than one without it. Another, the final one, although there are a number of minor criteria, atypicalities are more primitive than typicalities. When one version displays characteristics typical of an author's style or viewpoint, it generally is earlier than one that lacks such telltale traits. So these are the criteria one uses, and now we've established what the order of the synoptics are: Mark, Matthew, Luke. But this is where things become really messy, Jacob. In this slide, one sees at the top the two-document hypothesis. This is the one that is responsible for the most common understanding of Q. That is Luke's independence of Matthew. Luke does not know Matthew. And the quest for oscillating primitivity as evidence of Q. So here we have Luke does not know Matthew. Matthew and Luke have overlapping content not found in Mark. And therefore, you can use those criteria to determine which is earlier, Mark or Luke, and you ascribe that to Q. The Farr hypothesis says, no, that doesn't work. Luke knows Matthew. And if Luke knows Matthew, the overlapping content between Luke and Matthew can be attributed simply to Luke's use of Matthew. But that doesn't work entirely either. The Q plus Papias hypothesis takes a bit of both. It agrees that there's a lost gospel, but it also agrees with the Farr hypothesis that Luke knows Matthew. So how do you can't explain all of the parallels between Matthew and Luke as Luke's knowing Matthew, because by using reverse priority, you can see that Luke often is more primitive than what you find in Matthew. A good example is the so-called Lord's Prayer, which I prefer to call the disciples' prayer because it's what Jesus tells his disciples to pray. Another example is the Beatitudes that appear at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Luke's version is more primitive than that. He's not getting it from Matthew. He's getting it from somewhere else. The Q plus Papias hypothesis argues this, that there was a lost gospel that was known not only to Matthew and Luke, but also to Mark. That gospel was also known to Papius and his informant, the elder John. Mark was known, obviously, to the elder John and Papius, and also to Matthew and Luke. Matthew was known to Papias and Luke. So the quest for Q has to include the following. Matthew, Luke overlaps against Mark. This is congenial to the traditional Q hypothesis. Matthew and Luke have overlapping content. It's missing in Mark. They may have gotten it from a lost source, but they could do oral tradition or whatever, I guess. But in many cases, Luke has reverse priority to Matthew. He's not getting that material from Matthew. He's getting that from another source. So that agrees with the two document hypothesis and disagrees with the Farr hypothesis. Then we have another category of reverse priority of non-Markan doublets in Matthew and Luke. That is, Matthew and Luke both have about a dozen cases where they duplicate the same saying. But the cases of the non-Markan versions are always more primitive than the Markan ones. Now, that's not what happens if you're independently working with oral tradition, but it does happen if Mark is modifying a saying. He puts it in a more secondary way, and Matthew and Luke repeat both of them. Now, the next category is one that's exceedingly important but difficult to understand, and I'll explain it now, but then we have to run on. These are avoided doublets, and I express that with doublets with a double strike through. And I talk about it here. Often the two evangelists, Matthew and Luke, avoided duplicating content by omitting the version in Luke in favor of a more primitive version that appeared in a different context. So in some cases, the avoidance of a doublet functions like a doublet. And if you take a combination of these doublets and non-doublets, you can see two things that are important. One is that Matthew and Luke are getting content from someplace other than Mark. And that's what the traditional Q hypothesis is trying to accomplish. That is the two-document hypothesis. By the way, you can see how complex this gets. But it also shows that Mark knows somehow the same sayings. Does he know it because of oral tradition, or does he know it because he knows the same second source that Matthew and Luke are using? And that's what I'm convinced of. So then what can we do? Can we find the Q document in the Gospel of Mark? By the way, let me put it in a context and let you ask a question at this point before we get to Mark. You can see that this quest is similar to what you have in textual criticism in trying to understand how these texts relate to each other. And one then has criteria to determine what one would qualify, as evidence of a lost source. And so what we're doing with reconstructing Q, and this is true for the two-document hypothesis and for me, although we have different criteria, we're using criteria the way a textual critic would in order to make judgments about the grandparent text that lies behind the Gospels. And I think we're going to see that it's an exciting project, and it yields a very important result. Let's get to the next slide. Oh, actually, Jacob, hold it right there. Hold it right there. In the quest for Q in the Gospel of Mark, there's a common pattern called conflating. Matthew and Luke know the Gospel of Mark, and they redact it. But sometimes, in fact, many, many times, either Matthew or Luke contains wording that's more primitive than what you find in Mark. Now, how does that happen? It's because they see similar content both in Mark and in the Lost Gospel that has the more primitive wording. So in order to avoid duplicating these scenes, such as Jesus's baptism, they create an amalgam, or they conflate them. They merge them into their own version, borrowing eclectically from both. And this is where reverse priority becomes so important, because you can see where the more primitive wording appears in these texts and that these authors are conflating their material. So then there's a question, what do we do with these various logia or sayings that we can identify on the basis of the Matthew Luke overlaps against Mark, the doublets and the non-doublets, and conflation. Are they coming from oral tradition? Are they coming from multiple sources? Are they coming from a single source? And this is where the quest for Q's social identity becomes so important. That is, these materials create a database, and I'm not interested in the sequence of them at this point, but just a database that has a very distinctive social identity, a social identity that is demonstrably different from what we have in Mark and the Synoptics. In this case, Jesus is not primarily a miracle worker or a martyr. He's primarily a teacher. And he's a Jewish teacher. By the way, the Q document was not written by a Christian. It was written by a Jew who had a different understanding of Jewish Torah and wished to portray Jesus as the promised prophet like Moses, but with an interpretation of law that was more inclusive and compassionate. So Jesus is primarily a teacher. The word disciples appears of Jesus's followers for the first time in the Q document, and it simply means his students. So he's got an itinerating group. And they are the 12 disciples represent the stereotypical in-group, those who are following Jesus, who are trying to understand the mysteries of the kingdom of God that he proclaims, that have a compassionate understanding, and are courageous. And they are distinguished from outgroups. And the primary outgroups are Pharisees, who I would call Torah enforcers, and that the author is targeting the Jewish canonical past, namely Deuteronomy, to portray Jesus as the promised but compassionate prophet like Moses. In identifying then the social identity of the Q document, it's possible to include two other very important pericope. One is the story of the woman caught in adultery, which I prefer to call the pericope peccatori, the pericope of the sinful woman, and Jesus's threat against the temple. I will destroy this temple made with hands and build another not made with hands. Those are really congenial to the quest for the Q document. And of course, they're going to be very controversial. This is an aspect of the quest for Q that is most controversial. Nobody else has suggested this as I have, and yet I think it is the key to understanding the synoptic problem. And I can tell you that ardent defenders of traditional Q hypothesis would puke if they saw what I have tried to do here. We've talked about Mark's imitations of classical Greek poetry, especially the Homeric epics. And it's dramatic and it's brilliant and compelling. But within those imitations, I found 30, more like 40 examples of a Q material that gets embedded inside of that hybridity. So, for example, Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem is surely based on Odysseus's entry into the city of the Phaeacians in Odyssey 7. But what happens as he gets into the city? The crowds are shouting the Q saying, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." That's brilliant. So here you have a Q saying that is that appears in Matthew and Luke in a different context, and Mark has it, but in Mark, it's a part of his mimetic hybridity. And there are more examples like that. And so let me summarize and then let you ask questions, and I can talk about the significance of this. My reconstruction of Q differs from traditional reconstructions of Q primarily in two ways. That is, it accounts for Mark's use of the Q document by championing the notion of conflation, that Mark and the Q document have similar content, and Matthew and Luke, to avoid duplications, meld them together. The second is that many times the sayings of Jesus appear inside of Mark's imitations of Homer. And this for me was the most exciting part of putting together the synopses of epic poetry, synopses of epic tragedy and the Gospels, and now in writing Homer and the quest for Q and Jesus. Now, let me also then say one other thing. If I'm right, and by the way, I know I cannot be right in all the details, but if I'm right in this way of understanding, the Q document is by far the earliest and more expansive interpretation of the mission of Jesus that you have anywhere. And yet it is nearly invisible, not only to the public, but to scholars themselves. It helps to explain why Jesus was crucified, because he was so marginally Jewish according to this document. And by the way, I don't think we can say in this document of Q, we can be sure that Jesus said any of this stuff. But what we can say is that the author understood Jesus to have this role, and that role could get him in trouble with Jewish authorities, such as, I will destroy this temple and build another not made with hands, or to violate an observance of Mosaic law by not stoning a sinful woman, even though she was guilty and not repentant. So it's this, the discovery of the Q document, as flawed as it might be, and as subjective as it will necessarily be because of the use of criteria, nonetheless yields extremely important information about who Jesus was. And I think, and I'm not trying to be cute, I think to understand the historical Jesus, you have analogies in Socrates, in Martin King, and in Cesar Chavez. And it's characters like that that are socially upending and find violent deaths because of what they and their followers represent. So I guess there you have it. That's kind of a summary of what this book's about.
You were pointing out that that you do believe that Luke knew Matthew, but you also mentioned a little while ago that Luke contains some more primitive Q sayings most of the time than Matthew. So
Often,
how is it?
yeah. Sorry.
So my question is, because we've kind of talked about this before, partly. If Luke is borrowing from Matthew's material, why is that most of his material in the double tradition more primitive?
Yet again, you have to use those criteria for relative primitivity. So I'll give again the example of the Lord's Prayer. There can't be any doubt that Luke is getting the Lord's Prayer from someplace other than Matthew, because you can't explain why he has those differences. So yes, he knows Matthew. And yes, he knows something else. And the same thing's true of the Beatitudes. You cannot explain, in my view, And by the way, in this case, most scholars would agree with me on this. You can't generate Luke's Beatitudes from Matthew. Does he know Matthew's examples? Yeah, a Sermon on the Mount? Surely he does. But he knows something else because he's not getting this Lord's Prayer from Matthew. So Matthew's getting it from another source and has taken liberties with it.
And does that happen quite often between Luke and Matthew, that they both have this alternating primitivity throughout their Gospels?
Scores of times. And in my book, I have an entire appendix that charts those points of dependence, and also indicates places where Luke is more primitive than Matthew, and that's about more than half the examples.
I want to talk about Mark's knowledge of Q for a moment. Mark, in one of his examples of knowing Q, mentions the Beelzebul pericope, and the way he words it is a bit different from Matthew and Luke's wording of the Beelzebul pericope. Isn't that right?
It's not only different in wording, but the Markan version omits certain very important parts of what you find is overlaps between Matthew and Luke. What I find fascinating is that he then uses the things he's omitted in the Beelzebul controversy and uses it in his story of the frothing demoniac, about binding the man, about healing a deaf mute, about not having the defiling spirit return to the person who's been exorcised, and so on. So Mark is really a brilliant author, and the attempt to dumb Mark down because his language is not very sophisticated is really unfortunate, because I would say he's probably as skilled as any of the New Testament authors.
So does Mark, besides the Beelzebul story, contain other Q material of note?
Sure. Let's see what I could. He does not like the business about Jesus declaring he's going to destroy the temple. So what happens is that is on the lips of false teachers, false witnesses at his trial, and it's brought up by hecklers at the cross. And Jesus does tell his disciples the temple's going to be destroyed. He anticipates the Jewish war and the sack of Troy and the destruction of the temple. But it's going to be Romans who do it. He's not going to be the one to do it. Let's see. In my reconstruction, Mark's account of the baptism of Jesus, the temptation story, and the acquisition of disciples all display imitations of the Q document and are certainly secondary. Actually, I could go on and on. No one's asked the question of me quite that way to kind of ferret these out. There is no passion narrative in the Q document, though. Everything that takes place in the Q document takes place in Galilee. I'm glad you mentioned that. But of course, Jesus dies in Judea. And so Mark's task is to place Jesus in Judea prior to his execution to help explain how it is that this Galilean teacher becomes executed. And so much of the Q document then gets uprooted and then transplanted into the soil of Judea in order to anticipate the death of Jesus and his alleged resurrection.
How does Papias of Hierapolis contribute to the synoptic problem in your view?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because I did skip over that. And of course, the Q plus Papias hypothesis really requires attention to Papias. Papias has an informant, the elder John, probably the same person who wrote the Johannine epistles. And that John and Papias had problems with 3 Greek gospels they knew. One was the Gospel of Mark, although they don't call it a gospel, but they do attribute a book about Jesus to Mark. Then there are 2 Greek Gospels of Matthew that John the Elder and Papias both thought wrongly that were botched or somewhat flawed Greek translations of Matthew's Hebrew original. Now, one of those Matthews surely was similar to the Matthew that we have in the New Testaments that are printed today, but the other was lost. And by the way, Luke also knows of multiple Gospels. He knows of Mark and Matthew, but he probably also knew Papias and the Q document. It's not that Luke only knows 2 Gospels. Luke knows 4 or perhaps more. I think he knows 5. But Papias's witness is very important. Papias then wanted to return to Matthew's original sequence of these logia in order to recapture as much as possible the historical sequence of the materials. Now, he was credulous about these miracles. He was not a skeptic by any means, but he and John the Elder were concerned about the sequence of these materials. And so he set out to create his own gospel by augmenting it with things he'd heard from other people and so on. But he's extremely important, in my view, because he knows of a Greek gospel that was similar to Matthew that failed to survive. And I think what we can say about the reconstruction of Q plus is that it fits the criteria of Papias. That, in fact, in one of my chapters, I talk about the reconstruction of the discovery of Q is the discovery of Papias's alternative Matthew.
Could you talk about why you think that Luke knew Papias? I know that we talked about that before, but I kind of want to revisit it because some insist that Papias must have been quoting Luke Acts and not the other way around.
If Papias and Eusebius, who gives us these fragments, would have been crazy not to mention Luke or the Gospel of John as among the Papias things, but because Papias is, Eusebius in particular, is interested in showing how many of these texts were written before the time of Hadrian. So he would have been crazy not to, if he had seen Luke in Papias, he would have mentioned it. There should be no doubt about that. Now, the other is that Luke's preface is incredibly similar to the preface of Papias's book, including vocabulary, including problems about multiple gospels, about doing things accurately, about talking about the logoi of the Lord, talking about these alternative texts. And Luke and Papias are concerned about the same text, namely, Luke is concerned also about Matthew and Mark, and I think the lost gospel. So people have tried to say, no, Luke comes first and later than Papias. That doesn't make any sense to me at all for some of these reasons. And if one compares then the prefaces of the Gospel of Luke with the preface as can be reconstructed of Papias's work, there should be no doubt that you have Either similarities to a common source are more likely that Luke knows Matthew. But here's the other one that's a kick in the pants for me, and I think is decisive. Matthew talks about the death of Jesus as suicide. Papias knows that people were dissatisfied with that solution because what Judas did was so reprehensible that he cannot be restored among the 12 simply by killing himself. So, in fact, he survives his hanging, and God punishes him by turning him into a glutton so huge that he can't go through a chariot path. His body seeps pus, and that he dies in his field that has stench even to this day. I mean, it's a beautiful rhetorical death of the villain. Luke knows both both Matthew's account and Papias's, and he creates a hybrid. And he likes what Papias says about divine judgment, including all his guts pouring out and so on. But he also retains the business from Mark about purchasing the field of blood and so on. Now, people can try to scramble those three and put them in a different sequence, and it always fails. You have to have, so in this case, Luke knows Matthew and Papias. And if that's the case, they have to be listed among the things that the various diegeses, the expositions that he consulted in the composing of Luke Acts.
Could you elaborate on Aristion's diegesis that Papias talks about? Because I know that you do include that. I think I've seen that included in one of your diagrams.
Oh, I wish we knew more about Aristion. Papias talks about him both as a presbyteros, that is an elder, which means an ancient one in the Christian community, but also as a mathetes, along with John the Elder, and a mathetes, that is a disciple who's not one of the 12. Now, that is the assumption is that he was a disciple of Jesus that was not among the 12. Now, that's very interesting. When Eusebius talks about the content in Papias, he says that the work of Aristion and John the Elder is frequently cited by Papias. But he makes a distinction for the John the Elder. The content that Papias knew were the paratheses, that is, the traditions. But in the case of Aristion, it seems to have been a book that was called the diegeses, that's the expositions of the logoi of the Lord. And I think the Q document was called the logoi of Jesus. So you have the same wording that's used there. The word diegesis is the same word that Luke uses for the expositions that were done before him. And diegesis semantically functions very similar like exegesis, which is the name of the expositions of Papias. Now, it would appear to me that Aristion wrote a book that was cited frequently by Papias, and it was about the logoi of the Lord, of Jesus. Now, we don't know if that is simply their memories of a student about his teacher. We don't know if it's an exegesis of a book, but it's really tantalizing that the likely title of the Q document and the title of Aristion are very, very close in Greek.
And where can people get your reconstruction of Q?
It appears in the Synopses of Epic Tragedy and the Gospels, which is available. It's actually a synopsis of all the Gospels and much of the Acts of the Apostles. And you can get it Amazon.com for under $40. And I think it's quite a value. Again, I do hope to have Homer and the Quest for Q and Jesus out by the end of the summer. But if people can contact me by email, I can send them a PDF of the reconstruction in English. And actually, if they wish to have it in Greek, I can do that as well. I'll just send it to them.
And what is your email?
MacHomer 63@gmail.com. So the Mac comes from MacDonald. Homer comes from Homer. 63 comes from my age when I started that email account at gmail.com.
Thank you for joining me today, Dennis.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for this is a difficult topic. I know it is. I hope people can take an aspirin and get over the headache pretty soon.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.